So for you personally, could you tell the difference between when there was
Yes,
a high percentage of barley?
yes, but it was very difficult. You really needed to know what to look for. You know, we were, because of the barley brewing and because of the continuous fermentation, we took great care to monitor the alpha amino acid profile and to monitor the esters and the other sort of key features, both chemically and in the taste test panel. I mean, the taste test panel operated a minimum of once a week, 11 o'clock, and there was usually 2 taste test panels a week. We really seriously tasted the beer, but we also monitored the alpha amino nitrogen. And as I say, we did gas chromatography of what was coming out of the continuous fermentation compared to the batch fermentation. There was a lot of quality control going on, and as I say, if you know, when we tasted the samples that were going down to London to the central taste test, we knew that A was batch and B was continuous or whatever. But at least 50% of the time, London panel got it wrong, which tells you that they couldn't tell them apart.
Okay, that's interesting. But you weren't blending the batch and the
We some
continuous fermented beer.
not we didn't have to. We didn't feel we needed to. Sometimes inevitably we did, but sometimes we didn't. And I'm not convinced that anyone would be any the wiser, to be honest.
So okay, so is it mostly or exclusively heavy you were doing in the continuous fermented?
Yeah, that's the one big disadvantage of a continuous fermenter. You really can only produce one batch, one quality. The you know the total volume between the 3 vessels was about 320 barrels.
Okay.
And our brew house brew length was only 180 barrels. You know, it was the first Heineken in the country. It was a small one. So, you know, it would have taken us probably about 3 days. No, 20, it was 20. We ran it at 20 barrels an hour. So what's 20 barrels an hour into 320 barrels?
That's 16 hours.
16 hours, yeah. So it would have taken us 16 hours to flush the system through, assuming you were going to flush it through like a pig going down a pipe. And of course, it doesn't work like that. So it'd probably take you a good 2 days to swap from one quality to another. And in the meantime, you'd have a whole load of beer that was neither one thing nor the other.
Yeah. So did you ever do that, or did
No.
you only ever? Okay. And
What we
how often did you have to shut down for cleaning?
Well, that's an interesting one. Before I came on the scene, they used to try and run it as long as they could, and then they discovered that they were getting changes in the beer. And Ian Campbell at Heriot-Watt University described it as the yeast changing rather than the yeast mutating. He said he didn't feel it was as much as a mutation, but it was definitely a change. And the change was most noticeable in terms of a change in flavour. Now, any yeast can do this. I had a problem with the lager yeast at Mansfield. After about 13 generations, it used to mutate or change, whatever you want to call it. And funnily enough, the change manifested itself as smoky bacon flavor.
That's a bit strange.
Yeah, and I think the explanation there is that lager yeast is already kind of a little bit out of its comfort zone because of the lower temperature. And so it's probably already slightly strained. And any microorganism that's put under stress or strained is more likely to mutate to try and somehow adapt to the changed circumstances.
Yeah.
So I think that's the explanation of to why it happens, and presumably the yeast, the Watney's yeast that was used in all the continuous fermentation plants within Watney's was Watney's 118Y yeast.
Oh, so it wasn't the normal dry brew yeast.
Well, it became the normal dry brew yeast because that's what we used for everything else. But the original dry brew yeast that was there before the continuous fermentation was dropped in favor of the 118Y yeast, which was a really nice yeast. It was incredibly well behaved. It didn't produce a lot of diacetyl, and it reabsorbed any diacetyl it did produce very quickly. So it was considered to be a very friendly brewer friendly yeast. So that's what we used for everything.
And so that, sorry, apart from the lager, I guess.
Apart from Foster's, we were only ever allowed to brew Foster's, nothing else in terms of lager.
Oh, okay. This is interesting. But the yeast was that being harvested and repitched from the conical fermenters?
Sometimes, yes. We always tried to the stronger beers. We always tried to use continuous fermentation harvested yeast, because the continuous fermentation harvested yeast was much more vigorous. It really was like a racehorse at the start of fermentation in a cylinder conical. Repitching yeast from a cylinder conical to another cylinder conical via we always took the barm off. We put the head from the continuous from the conical into a barm tank, passed it through a filter, recovered the barm ale, returned that to the cylinder conical, and the yeast from the filter was generally packed into bags into a cold store, and then repitched into a creaming tank if it was needed for repitching. And the yeast from the continuous fermenter, similarly, there was a filter underneath that last vessel, the steep coned vessel, and we filtered the barm ale back into the buffer tank that was collecting the beer from that final vessel. So you'd a system of buffer tanks with wort in them, feeding that U-tube into the first vessel and the second vessel, third vessel, from there back into buffer tanks for the beer. So you'd buffer tanks at both ends of the system.
Okay, that makes sense.
I could draw this for you, Ron, if you want.
Well, the article I was on about has a nice drawing, actually.
Oh,
the Bishop article.
There are some pretty good drawings of the Bishop system around.
I mean, the one in Briggs, Brewing Practice and Science, is obviously taken from the Bishop one. It's the same, basically the same drawing.
Almost certainly. I'll tell you a funny story. When I was brewhouse and fermentation manager at Drybrews, I got a phone call from Ian Campbell at Watt University. The students were coming on their sort of Wednesday afternoon brewery visit, and this was on the Tuesday. So Ian, maybe it was the Monday, Ian was going to give them the lecture on the continuous fermentation process prior to their visit. And here's him phoning me up, asking me how the continuous fermenter worked. And I'm thinking, yeah, 2 years ago, you were telling me how it worked, and now I'm telling you how it worked. So he was obviously phoning up just to make sure he got it all right and they didn't make any mistakes. Another funny story, Dr. Button, the quality control guy we were talking about earlier. I was in the Black Eagle in Truman's in Brick Lane, which sort of doubled as a sample room come visitors sort of entertainment area. and got talking to Dr. Button about how the oxygen was injected into the U-tube. And I said it was done one way, and he said, no, it's not. It's done the other way. And I thought, well, I'm the manager of the plant. Surely I should know. But apparently he wasn't going to back down. And he said, well, I'm up next week anyway, so you could show me and we'll see who's right. And I thought, oh, you idiot. You know, I wouldn't say something if I wasn't absolutely 100% sure, especially not to someone like the chief quality control manager of the company. Anyway, the following week, production director put his head round my door and he said, Dr. Button's here and he wants to see you. And he says, what have you been saying to him? So I took him down to the continuous fermenter and we looked at how the oxygen was injected into the U-tube, and he turned to me, and this is where I had this horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. He could turn round and say that he had been right and that what I had said was what he was saying, if you see what I mean. He could have turned around and said, so you were wrong, George. You know, no, that's... But gentleman that he was, he said, you were right and I was wrong. And I thought, he could have easily turned that round the other way, because it was his word against mine sort of thing, you know. But no, I suppose he had nothing to lose, really. It was just, you know, I was just a little brewer and he was sort of the big cheese quality control guy. Anyway, yeah, continuous fermentation. It required a lot more process control. Temperature was extremely important. Oxygenation was important. We used to monitor the yeast count very carefully. So if the yeast count started dropping, we would reduce the pumping rate. So I said to you that the normal pumping rate was 20 barrels an hour. But if the yeast count of the concentration of yeast in the first two stirred vessels started dropping, we would drop that pumping rate down to give, so we weren't flushing the system through the same. And similarly, if the yeast count was going above what we considered to be the right level, we would increase the pumping rate. But the normal state of affairs at the temperature that was considered to be optimal and the oxygenation level that was optimal, the pumping rate was 20 barrels an hour.
Okay.
So and you can go and design your own continuous fermenter now, Ron.
And how long did it take on average to get warped through the fermenter?
Well, that's an interesting one, because we didn't run it continuously 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We actually let it have a rest over the weekend. So it would get the first wort from the brew house on Sunday night, Monday morning, and the last wort would go through the fermenter, and we'd slow it down. We'd drop the temperature down, and we'd gradually slow the pumping rate down. Probably sort of Friday night. So it would have approximately a little bit more than 36 hours, probably about 40 hours of a rest over the weekend.
Okay.
And then it would start up again on Monday. And funnily enough, that it seemed to quite like that rest, because we didn't brew on a bank holiday Monday. So it would have an even longer rest if we had a bank holiday. And by about Tuesday, Wednesday, after the bank holiday, it was up and running again. And it was, if anything, a bit perkier than normal. It seemed to like having bank holidays. As I said, I was starting to tell you, before I was on the scene, they used to run it as long as possible, and they used to get these sort of changes which first sort of thing you noticed was flavour, but there were other changes, flocculation and various other things changed a wee bit. So they decided, rather than running it until it started showing these changes, they would run it for 6 months. So by the time I was involved, the ritual was to run the system for 6 months, run it out, empty the system out, and then we completely deterged everything, and then we sterilized it with steam, and then we started it up again. And we did that midsummer week and the week between Christmas and New Year. That was the standard practice. And one Christmas New Year shutdown, there's certain things we did at certain times. It was all sort of very much stipulated what you did when. And I went in late in the evening, probably about 9 o'clock, to switch the steam off and put a sterile filter in place so that the system wouldn't suck in, potentially contaminated air, but would the air that replaced the steam in the system would go through this big filter, which we had to manually put attached to the door of the first vessel in the system. It wasn't there permanently attached. It had to be sort of. So I had to go up on a little gantry next to this door, turn off the steam supply, and watch the pressure gauge go down to 0, and then open the door. There was sort of like eight bolts on this door. Open the door, and then put the filter over the door. As it turned out on this particular occasion, so this would have been between Christmas and New Year 81, I think. Yeah. And on this particular occasion, the pressure gauge was faulty. So when it was reading 0, it was actually still 320 barrels worth of steam at something like about 10, 15 psi, which doesn't sound a lot. But luckily, the last bolt on the door that I undid was at the 4 o'clock position. So when I undid that bolt, the door flew open, and a 2 feet wide column of steam flashed up past my front. Because it was midwinter and not the midsummer changeover or cleaning setup, I had a vest, a shirt, a jumper, and a thick woolen donkey jacket on. So I was only scalded from the bottom of my tummy to my chin because I threw myself back. If it had been summer, I would have just been wearing a shirt, and I'm probably wearing my white lab coat because that's what we did in those days. But the difference between 2 layers of fabric and all the different layers I was wearing in the wintertime saved me, I would say, from plastic, what you call it, plastic surgery. Because I was just badly scalded, and calamine lotion was all I needed. But of course, I was on top of this little gantry, and when I threw myself back, I went flying in midair. And luckily, there was a big, strong operator who'd actually been a coal miner in a previous life, who caught me like a ballerina catching a ballerina. Bloody hell, I got the shock of my life. So yeah, I've never trusted one single gauge on its own ever again. You just don't know if it's reading true or not.
Yeah, well, they can be dangerous places, breweries.
Yeah, I mean, oh God, there was a guy in Drybrews. I won't tell you his name, but he basically had no face, and he'd made the mistake of adding caustic to boiling water, and it just boiled up and completely removed his face. And luckily, he screamed so loudly that someone heard him and came running and hosed him down with a cold water hose. Otherwise, he would have been dead. But yeah, it was, you know, that it's the sort of classic Spitfire pilot, you know, with the burnt face. It was that kind of effect, and it was a health and safety lesson to everyone else. You know, don't add caustic to hot water.
Yeah. What I'm going to say is that because I haven't paid for the paid for version of Zoom, this meeting is going to end in about a minute. But
Right.
if you'd like to talk some more, I can just start it up again.
Yeah. Well, it's up to you. Do some more now, or do some more if you've thought of anything you want to ask, or.
Oh, we can. I mean, one of the biggest things I wanted to know is why was it removed, the system?
I am not entirely convinced as to whether that was totally thought out. The production director decided, well, it was a continuous 24-hour continental shift, and that was the only continental shift apart from the boiler house in the brewery. So I think, you know, even if the system wasn't running, it needed to be checked every sort of hour. So it had to be, you know, 24 hours, 7 days a week operation. So I think that cost was something that was considered possibly unnecessary. I think the reason I was being encouraged to leave and the place was basically being run down is that the production director knew that the brewery they were looking to sell it. And of course, none of us knew that. And I think they were just sort of winding the whole shooting match down. But the